afternoon, everyone. I'm Suzie Feay. I'm going to be chairing the whole thing. Happy International Women's Day, everybody. We were all in the green room talking about our hair and whether you should be allowed to marry your cousins. So I just wonder if we had Ian McEwan and Salman Rushdie and so on, whether the conversation would have been anywhere near as interesting as that. Anyway, it's a total delight to be here with these fantastic writers, and we are going to each come up with a couple of writers who we find inspirational. I notice it says writing heroes. They're all heroines, and I don't think heroine is a disparaging term. I think we can call them heroines because they're all women. I mean, do we think they should be heroes? To me, I like the idea of, I like actresses, I like heroines, I don't like poetesses.
Poetesses, I was just going to say, so no one draws the line at a poetess. It's
exactly.
Ridiculous.
Heroine's a great word. You can't have woman hero.
No,
it doesn't sound right, does it?
Yeah.
So our writing heroines and our inspirational women are what we're going to be discussing. And I just wanted to kick off with a basic question, really. What do we look for in an inspiring writer-heroine, or a writer who inspires us? Because as I started to think about this, I thought it's a little bit trickier than I thought, because women whose writing I absolutely love aren't necessarily personally people that I identify with. So I just wondered whether, in coming up with the people that you've come up with, you were pondering these issues as well. Anyone want to fire away? Tessa?
Well, of course, as with the male writers one loves, it's really simple. You just want them to be writing well. So their personal lives, one immediately becomes fascinated with. I was brought up that you weren't allowed to think about writers' biographies, but actually that is rubbish, isn't it? And one can't help going on to be interested in the person. But in the end, the reason you love the writers you love is because you love the words they put together on the page and the life they fill the words with.
Frances, you're a biographer, so what's your take on that? Do you think it's an appropriate thing to look at the messy lives as well as the perfect art?
Well, just like Tessa, and I was brought up to believe that it was sort of sacrilegious to look at a writer's biography or to compare a writer's work to their biographical life. And so I see what I do as tremendously transgressive. Actually. But I do. I love the saltiness of private life, and the way in which it feeds into a prose or poetry that's trying to beat it back. But in the end, it's the words on the page, and for me, it's always going to be style over plot.
Oh, okay, yeah. Right. That's what you look for.
Yeah.
Yeah. Deborah?
Well, I have to confess, I do love looking at a life, and I have a problem because some of the female lives, women who've really made their freedom, someone like Isabel Eberhardt, who, she was Swiss, she dressed up as an Arab man and she rode a horse into the desert and she married a soldier from the Foreign Legion, and she wrote a diary in the desert. But I have to say that her diary isn't as good as Virginia Woolf's, and that I'm more interested in her life than I am in her writing. I do think, as David Bowie said, that we can all be heroes for one day, and perhaps we can all be heroines for 2 days.
Very good.
There's a little bit of a link with Isabel Eberhardt and my choice of writer, which is 3 Virago books, because I came across Isabel Eberhardt, one of those wonderful green-spined books. I can't remember. I think it was somebody writing about her rather than her writing. I think excerpts from her diary. And my writer that I'm going to talk about is Antonia White, who was the very first Virago. I think she was the first Virago classic.
She was, yes.
So that, I think things like Virago have helped enormously in bringing women's writing to the fore. It's so much so that it's a bit hard to imagine what it could have been like before Virago. So I think maybe Carmen Khalil is a heroine.
I think it's
in
because
many
Carmen
ways.
Khalil loved Antonia White that she launched the whole of the Virago classics. It was launched around Antonia White.
So it wouldn't have happened without her in a funny kind of way.
And so many of the people we're going to talk about were out of print and kind
Yes.
of passed over and forgotten. So many of the
Yes.
Yes.
mid-20th century ones.
Although interestingly, the books I read as a child, I didn't gender the writers. So for instance, E. Nesbit,
Yeah.
The Phoenix and the Carpet, and it, you know, to this day, I still secretly half believe carpets can fly. When those children in the nursery unroll a carpet, their mothers bought them, and a phoenix egg rolls into the fire and it hatches. I never thought E. Nesbit. I'd never thought about the gender of the writer. So that's something that kind of comes in later in a strange sort of way.
I think it's the same now with J.K. Rowling.
Maybe.
I think it's... she's not seen as a woman writer at all, just a writer.
And E. Nesbit, I don't actually know lots about her life, but she was one of those heroic writers in the sense of just earning money from writing and writing and writing. And Mrs. Oliphant in the 19th century with a hopeless husband who then, I think, died young, just staying up at night, running a household all day, having children, many of whom died, and then staying up, burning the candle, writing her novels. So that's one kind of heroism, isn't it? Just doing it and just making a living by it and actually supporting her great big extended family through it.
Yes.
I think Nesbit, I don't know much about her, but I have this feeling that she married unsuitable men who were much younger and then who lived off her, basically.
Oh,
so
right.
she really was scribbling away and supporting.
That's a great bit of biographical tip. Makes it instantly more interesting.
Okay, so we will begin, let's begin right at the end with Tessa. You're going to read something and then talk about your first literary heroine for us, please.
You want me to talk about one of my heroines?
Yes, please, yes.
Okay, I was going to start with Elizabeth Bowen, who's a tremendous heroine of mine in lots of ways that somehow does have to do with her biography as well. But first of all, just the lovely writing. I discovered her when I was very young, and I promoted myself to adult books in the local library. I just thought, I've read all the children's books that interest me, and I'm going up these 3 steps, and I'm going to borrow this. And I read all kinds of very weird things.
Did you get to B then, when you went into the grown-up library? Was that how you found Elizabeth Bowen?
I don't think I was doing... do you know what I liked? I liked the writers where there were lots of uniform volumes.
Yes.
Right.
Because that's what I'd loved, Anne of Green Gables and all the other and E. Nesbit, actually. So uniform volumes, that's what brought me to Bowen, as along with Compton Mackenzie and some other strange people I've now forgotten. But she was produced in a beautiful series with lovely woodcuts on the front. I loved the woodcut. I loved the words. And I couldn't really work out what was going on. I was probably only 13 or 12 or 13, but I remember some sensation of texture. It was thick, rich, interesting. I had no idea that lots of it was taking place in Ireland. But that reading you do at that age is wonderful, isn't it? When you're piecing the world together out of clues, and half of what you need is missing, but you have to do it, otherwise you'll never get there. So, and then I forgot her, and then rediscovered her as an adult and just found
And
she's
what was
the
that
most
experience
inspiring.
like, the rediscovery?
Wonderfully confirming, because you're always afraid that you go back to those books that have meant a lot to you as a child or a young person, and they're flimsy and they don't do it anymore, and they're so disappointing. And you wish you hadn't actually ever opened them up, because the dream book would have stayed there. But no, she's a marvellous writer. And if I think about what I use her for in my imagination when I'm thinking about writing, it's the compression and intensity, nothing ever wasted, and every single word and sentence revealing and astonishing. So nothing slack or lazy.
She's a great short story writer as
Superb
well,
short
isn't
story
she?
writer.
Has she influenced you in your work? Because you write novels and short stories.
Yeah. I mean, in as far as she's marvellous, and to do it like that is just, one sets one's sights on it, not you know, not thinking you can do that well. But
I think that's what Matthew McConaughey said in his Oscar speech, isn't he? That there's somebody a bit ahead of you.
That's
So
it.
for him, it's himself, I believe, if I understood him right. But for you, it's Elizabeth
For me,
Bowen.
it's Elizabeth Bowen.
So what would you recommend if people want to scribble down a few
Short
titles
stories,
right
actually.
now?
I really do, the short stories. But then there's her beautiful novel about adolescence called The Death of the Heart, which is about a very young girl sort of put to live with her much older brother, half-brother, and his wife in a stuffy, privileged, wealthy house off Regent's Park. But it's the girl who's the wrecker. In her lovely, fresh innocence and her appetite for life, she actually ruins all their lives that with maturity are held together with fragile sort of contrivances. And she goes in there like a bomb going off.
There's a wonderful photograph of Elizabeth Bowen and Sylvia Plath.
I've got that, Deborah. Isn't
And how did they meet
Well,
then?
Sylvia
What was-
Plath is very young. She must have
She's
just...
interviewing
She's
her.
interviewing.
Oh, was this at
Elizabeth
Mamselle?
Bowen. And, she's, so Sylvia Plath is in white gloves and she's in a white plastic necklace and matching earrings. And she's got her notebook out and she's sitting very straight and she obviously is one of her first jobs.
Yes.
And Elizabeth Bowen is looking rather sort of sophisticated and middle-aged and she's got a sort of chignon and she's smoking. And she's obviously just cracked a joke because Sylvia Plath is laughing. And it's the only photograph I've ever seen of Sylvia Plath. It looks sort of maybe a bit like how she was. You know, her teeth are slightly crooked and she throws her head back and she's laughing away. It's a beautiful photograph.
If that's when she was at Mamselle, of course, the experience, not just Bowen, but the whole experience did go into the bell jar, which is maybe not so much of the laughter made its way into the bell jar. Brilliant. Okay, would you like to read your passage about reading now? Because that's very apposite.
From
to
my
what
own book?
Yeah, I thought that might be a
sure.
nice
So
introduction.
this is from my last novel, which is called Clever Girl, and it is a little bit about my heroine as a reader. And I think all you need to know is that she was an avid reader as a girl. She's waylaid by pregnancy, very young. That's a bit of a spoiler, but never mind. And now with her one baby, two babies, oh gosh, anyway, with her baby. She's living with a friend who's an English teacher, a man. When Fred tried to persuade me to read books, and I told him I was too busy, it wasn't the truth. Actually, I was reading all the time, in bed or while Rowan napped in the afternoons or on the sofa in the sitting room in the evening if Fred, that's her friend, went out. And at the art gallery where I was working, sometimes there were no customers for hours at a time, and I always had a novel on the go. But for some reason, I wanted to keep my reading secret from Fred. Perhaps I just felt that too much of my life was already open to his view and I needed to hold something back. I'd stopped reading abruptly when I got pregnant with Luke and had to leave school, and the whole plan for my life changed track, or rather fell into abeyance where there was no track at all. I think I felt cheated, as if the books I'd loved had held out a promise of strong, bright, meaningful happenings they couldn't deliver. If I'd read more carefully, I'd have seen that falling off a track and nosing round and round unhappily in a tight circle was just what most books described. Yet for a long time, first when Luke was a baby and I worked at the school, and then when I lived in the commune and Rowan was born, my memory of the fiction I'd once read was tainted with a suspicion that it was written for somebody else, for somebody initiated into a higher order of culture which shut me out. I'd once read Beckett and Burroughs. Now, I imagined those authors as my enemies because I thought they'd have despised the things I had no choice but to spend my life on. Washing, cooking, shopping, cleaning.
Brilliant. It's very good on the sense that you're building an identity and also that books are reading you. While you're reading books, they're reading you. And I certainly felt that very strongly when I was finding my way through the world of fiction. We'll go on to Frances Wilson. Do you want to tell us a bit about your first choice of literary heroine?
Well, my first choice is Dorothy Wordsworth, and so we're going back to the idea of diaries and journals. It's Dorothy Wordsworth's Grasmere journals, which I love because I love reading other people's diaries, and I think are very interesting precisely because I think they've been very misread. And I was, they're a book, it's a book that I discovered very late in my life because as a child I was hugely put off Dorothy Wordsworth because my grandmother liked her so much and had... and my grandmother's edition was an Oxford University Press edition with a white cover and a kind of slightly sort of dying flower on the front. And I thought it looked unbelievably turgid. And my grandmother never read anything racy or dark. And so I steered away from Dorothy Wordsworth. And then when I finally did get round to reading her, it was like I'd been plugged into the national grid. And I realised that this woman was not writing about nature. I mean, she is our first woman nature writer. But there was something that she was writing about that was completely cutting against writing about nature. She was writing about something very unnatural, which was being in love with her brother. And every single entry in the journals seemed to be about her refusal to acknowledge that she was in love with her brother. And this was very, very much my subject here. And so I sort of thrilled to this writing. And as I read my way through Dorothy Wordsworth, I found that there was this kind of huge tension in the Wordsworth industry precisely about what she was writing about, because as she was documenting this sort of these extremely complicated emotions that she had for William, and emotions that she wasn't even aware of having. And I have to say that the journals, the Grasmere journals, are written during the 2.5 years prior to William Wordsworth's getting married to Dorothy's best friend, Mary. So Dorothy's waiting for this marriage to take place, and she's living with William as a couple, as a married couple in their cottage, in Dove Cottage. And she records every single day as if it's the last day she's going to be alive on earth. Never once mentioning Mary Hutchinson, never once mentioning any of the conversations that Wordsworth and Coleridge were having at that time, possibly the most interesting conversations on earth about lyrical ballads. They were setting up an entire poetic revolution. She doesn't write about this at all.
So when are they set again? Just remind us, is this the 1790s or
yeah,
a bit
they're
later
set
than
in,
that? Or?
She begins them at the end of 1799, and they end in 1802 when Wordsworth gets married. And they do record nature in the finest detail, but there's something else going on there, and this is why I admire her so much, because she managed to inject into this writing an extremely tumultuous unconscious life, which I find very, very moving and very thrilling. And I'm also fascinated by her journals because they were precisely not seen as writing. Writing was what William Wordsworth did, and Dorothy Wordsworth didn't do writing, she did journals. Even though William Wordsworth pillaged her journals for his themes, you could never think of a subject ever.
I was going to ask you where you stand on that. I mean, it is pretty much that she was doing all the nature observing and he was turning it into poetry.
She described the daffodils, and he thought, oh, what shall I write about? And 3 years later, says, oh, that daffodil description, and lists it, and then describes himself as being there alone, wandering lonely as a cloud when he was there with Dorothy. And so she's always been completely sort of excised. But William Wordsworth never spent a second on his own, ever. He was the most codependent man in the world. I think all poets are, actually. He did everything with Dorothy there, and he hated the physical act of writing, and so she physically wrote everything down for him, and she records this in her journals as well. But she was, even though she did literally vastly more writing than Wordsworth did, because she was his amanuensis, what she was seen as doing was not writing. And I love these journals for their status as not writing. And then finally, the thing that I find fascinating about her is the way in which she's been represented by by Wordsworthians and the Wordsworth industry is this woman who, very strangely enough, was unlike any other woman on earth because she had no sexuality or desire. She was very, very happy to forsake all of that to live with her brother forever, even though she went completely mad after he got married. And it was no sacrifice for her whatsoever because she had no sexuality and desire. And what you feel when you read the journals is that this woman had sexuality and desire in excess. It was just unfortunately directed towards her brother, and so, which is not what Wordsworthians want. And so I see it as a very transgressive, the Grassmere journals is tremendously transgressive and poignant and sad and saying everything and nothing. And I don't think anyone can agree what their subject matter is. And I certainly don't know. And I like writing, which is that uncertain about itself.
So is that why you chose to write about her? I mean, were you just gripped by this? This was a story that needed to be told from a different perspective.
Yes, yes. When I wrote a book about Dorothy Wordsworth several years ago called The Ballad of Dorothy Wordsworth, which takes only those 2.5 years that she was living with Wordsworth prior to his marriage, and I tried to kind of stop the clock and look at her day-to-day resistance to the facts, if you like. So it was very slow reading of her journals, and I wanted to actually hear her voice properly, because I think she's been completely muted by a sort of a sentimentalization of the sister figure, and sisters were never sentimental in romantic literature. They were always, darkly sexy figures. And I think Dorothy Wordsworth was one of them.
Would you like to read a bit from the ballad?
I'm going to read just very briefly, because everything about Dorothy Wordsworth is brief, and I like her for that. And I want to read from the beginning of a chapter where I'm picking up on a moment in Dorothy Wordsworth's journals where she's describing William as having left. William's left the cottage to go away for a few days. And normally when William leaves to go away, she falls into a slough of despond. And that's not the case here. So there's something as ever, it's very inward and very subjective, but something else is happening. So before they'd finished breakfast on the morning of the 4th of March, 1802, the horses arrived for William's trip. There was a flurry in the cottage as pens were made, poems put in order for copying, and clothes flung together. Once William had gone, Dorothy busied herself with tidying the strewn drawers and sorting out the shirts, which we had thrown here and there and everywhere in the rush. She filed 2 months' worth of newspapers, boiled eggs for lunch, and transplanted snowdrops from the garden. Noted that the bees were busy, that William had a rich, bright day for his journey, and that the robins were singing. "Now for my walk," she writes, before pausing to exclaim, "I will be busy. I will look well and be well when he comes back to me. Oh, the darling! Here's one of his bitten apples. I can hardly find it in my heart to throw it into the fire. I must wash myself and then off." It's one of those moments when the reader feels jolted awake, afraid he or she might have missed something that came before. Nothing in the previous day's entry offers an explanation for the level of intimacy Dorothy now feels. As with her appearance by the poet's side at the end of Tintern Abbey, the sudden vividness of Dorothy's person this morning is so unexpected, so immediate, you wonder how long she's been in the room without your noticing. Our presence at the door seems voyeuristic. We're not prepared to witness emotion as undiluted as this. The warmth and urgency of her tone are startling, but so too is the scene she paints. A woman is bustling about, scolding herself for her tears and summoning up the strength to pull through yet another of her darling's absences. She then pauses in her tracks at a sign of his recent presence and invests the now browned apple with all the tenderness she feels for its consumer. The shift in tense is disconcerting, as when a conventional frame in a film is followed by the jerkiness of a handheld camera. But there's something else as well that feels not right. Where is Dorothy's usual melancholia and sense of abandonment when William leaves her? On his previous trips, time has stopped and her movements become torpid. But today there's fluster and even silliness. She's jittery, tearful, slightly euphoric. She feels, for some reason, especially close to William. During her walk, Dorothy sat down where I always sit. I was full of thoughts about my darling, blessings on him. When she returns home, she works at her German, reads the lyrical ballads, and then writes him a letter before going to bed. Dorothy's journal entry for the 4th of March has about it a post-coital intensity. The late breakfast, the last-minute haste of William's departure, her determination to disguise from him her feelings, her dreaminess as she sorts through his clothes and clears away his mess. There is a terrible foreboding. The apple is bitten, paradise is lost.
It's really fascinating, isn't it, listening to that? How really sensibility changes.
Yeah.
People are not the same. There are lots of ingredients and we can recognise it and imagine it, but that doesn't feel like any category of experience that's quite available now.
Yes, that's absolutely right. It's absolutely right. It's completely foreign, isn't it?
Yeah.
She would have had a lot of mud on her boots going out on those walks.
Certainly, yes. Yeah, and her clothes were caked in mud as well. And I think she was permanently caked in mud.
Well, we've taken a turn towards the decidedly strange with Frances. Are we going to continue this with Deborah? Where are you going to take us in pursuit of a heroine?
Oh, it was so hard to choose. You can imagine. I mean, how could I give up on Catherine Mansfield? Marguerite Duras is my top writing heroine. Then sort of lesser-known writers like Anna Kavan and Quinn. But in the end, I thought that I'd like to talk today about Gertrude Stein. And I'll tell you why. It's because it took me so long to ever get round to reading her books. For years, her baffling and beguiling books have been on my shelves, and I've kind of imagined I've read them. And I'd always liked them being there. I had great respect for her experimental courage, and she's just a sort of invigorating presence on my shelves, but I sort of browsed them. And then 20 years later, when I moved recently, I started to read her trilogy, 3 Lives, which she called 3 psychological portraits of 3 different kinds of women. I reread the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, and I thought they were really tremendous. One of the things that really interests me about Gertrude Stein was that she was a psychology student. She won herself a place. She was born in 1874, think about this. So she's 23 when she wins a place at Radcliffe College, which is now Harvard, and she reads psychology and goes on to begin a medical training for 8 years. So she's looking down the microscope at skulls. She's writing papers on the brain. And for someone who was going to be described as the mama of Dada, just think about what she wore as a student. The mama of Dada is in. I researched this. I looked this up. She's in a long, heavy skirt. The hem has straw or horsehair sewn in to sort of keep it on the ground. She's in a very tight blouse, buttoned up to the neck, with mutton chop sleeves. She can't get to class as quickly as the male students. And why did she read psychology? She told William James, brother of Henry, who was her tutor, and who loved this rollicking girl. He thought she was very eccentric and sort of described her as his most brilliant female student. She said, well, I saw a man hitting a woman on the head with an umbrella, and I wanted to discover what made him behave like that. So that was... So the other thing about Gertrude Stein is that when she moved to Paris to join her brother, And they, you know, and there was, of course, the famous art collection and all of that. And she falls in love with Alice Babette Toklas, moves her in, sends the brother away. She's beginning to make what she calls the part of herself that was made in Paris. She's an American. She's beginning to claim her freedom. Off goes the corset. Her sentences start to spread too. She doesn't like punctuation. She says commas are servile. She never had to kill the angel in the house because Alice Babette Toklas was the angel in the house. There's a fantastic anecdote about a dinner party they went to, and Gertrude hogged all the conversation and turned it into a monologue. So as they were leaving, Alice said to the host, "Tonight, Gertrude has said things it will take her years to understand." And I do think it is very important to say things it takes us years to understand in this kind of, at this time in our culture when everything has to be hyper-intelligible, where any sort of complexity is thought to be sort of commercial suicide. So just to go back to the autobiography, which of course is the book that made her famous, it's disguised as an autobiography. She's really writing about herself, pretending to write about Alice. It's a complete genre-busting strategy. She writes in the continuous present. This was her thing. Even in this autobiography, Stein scholars think this is sort of one of the lesser books, but I don't believe it is. I think it's incredibly entertaining, formally inventive, and a good mash of kind of travel writing, autobiography, a treatise on art, all the art she was collecting, with this amazing end, which she repeats in her essay on Picasso, where she says that for the first time she ever went up in an airplane was when she was on her American tour, and she looks down and she sees all the squares and the lines on the earth. And this was what the Cubists were painting way before they went up in an airplane. So that idea that artists and writers write what is already there, but which cannot be seen until she was up in that aeroplane looking down, sort of fascinated me. I recommend 3 Lives. I recommend the autobiography. And if you've got the taste for it, just you know, to browse through, try The Making of Americans. It's a great stretch of early female modernist writing. It was finished in 1911, and it was only published in 1925 after Ulysses. So she was very wounded. You know, poor James Joyce, it wasn't a breeze for him to get published. But she was very wounded about that, because this 1,000-page novel, which had used so much of her psychology training to get to what she described as the bottom nature of character, had laid like an unclaimed suicide in a drawer for about 15 years. So it sort of predates Ulysses, and well worth, you know, taking a look at it. One of her biographers, Janet Malcolm, actually had to saw the book with a carving knife in 6 parts and carry it around with her on the metro to read it. So you could try that too.
Did she and Joyce influence each other, or were they both tapping into the zeitgeist in their different ways? How did that come about?
Well, Stein was writing 3 Lives at the same time Joyce was writing The Dubliners. I think that they kind of hissed at each other in Paris. I think Joyce said, "I believe we live in the same neighborhood." And Stein said, "Alice and I are off to pick wildflowers now." So kind of
No love
thing.
lost,
Yeah.
doesn't sound like. She's famous for being Gertrude Stein, isn't she? I mean, she's a huge figure, I think, in the imagination, but I would have thought not many people sit down and read the books, so it's well worth
absolutely.
doing that. But she did have a profound influence on culture generally, didn't she?
Yeah, she was more contemporary than I am, Gertrude Stein. You know, in all her books, she has the author sort of writing away in the corner. She refers to the author. And so although some of the work is incredibly repetitive, that was her thing. She didn't want to nail a thought. She was interested in the movement and flow of thought. And I think she did believe in full stops. Whereas somebody like Marguerite Duras, you know, is the opposite of that. She's incredibly pared down. I don't think there's a better novel than The Lover, but the opposite. Gertrude Stein was really much more interested in chasing a perception until to the end, but well worth looking at how she at those experiments, and they're much more readable than this conspiracy that I bought. You know, I mean, think about this. I was culturally pointed to all the modernist male big beasts: Joyce, Eliot, Pound, Beckett. No one ever said to me, "Why don't you have a look at Gertrude Stein and see what you make of her?" So have a look at Gertrude Stein and see what you think.
So I'll talk about the first one of mine, which is Antonia White, who I've already mentioned. And I think one of the things that we're getting at is it's tremendously important how you encounter a writer for the first time and what you bring to that encounter. So I was given a copy of a book called The Sugar House by a very difficult person that I knew who gave rather barbed and strange presents that generally meant something. So I got a copy of The Sugar House. The first thing, it was the Virago, and the first thing I saw was it was the third in a sequence, and I thought, that's another totally pointless present that this person has given me. Why would I want to read the third in a sequence of anything? Thanks very much, that's on the shelf. So it then took me years, I think I'd heard of Frost in May. Years later, I thought, right, I'll take that book down, I'll read it, but I'll read the other two first. I think the first one is Frost in May, and then The Lost Traveller, then The Sugar House, and they're all so incredible. She is one of the most wonderful, sort of pure writers. And then the final one in that sequence is Beyond the Glass, and they are very autobiographical. And she then really ran into writer's block quite severely and spent the rest of her life trying and kind of failing to write more about this character who's sort of her. And my theory about that is as her life got really complicated from about the age of 21, she started making mistakes in her life, and it was very difficult to move from this saga of this, you know, this sort of quite lost girl to whom bad things happen. I think she couldn't make the transition into being an adult where you have to take quite a bit of responsibility. But they're perfectly written, and they are so evocative that when I was reading them, I thought that I was her. A bit like you were saying about E. Nesbit, and you thought that there might be phoenixes and carpets that flew. I somehow thought that I too had been born in 1899, and I'd lived through these experiences. And Beyond the Glass is actually about a mental breakdown, and it's an extraordinary story. They're lightly fictionalised, but then when you look into her life and read her biography, you see that actually almost the weirdness of it is not made up. I mean, she started to sort of correspond telepathically with her boyfriend at the time, so much so that they didn't say, "I'll meet you outside the Coach and Horses at 7. They kind of went, and then they both turned up outside the Coach and Horses at 7 or whatever. I inhabited these extraordinary books. They completely possessed me. And I read them at a certain period of my life, and I haven't read them for years, and now I'm slightly afraid to. Oh, but I'm partly because I don't think I could go through all that emotion again. And we were talking about it earlier on, and talking about her biography, and there's something very strange going on with her and her father. Tessa, you've read some Antonia White, haven't you?
Yes, I have. I've read that the same 4 books. And yeah, I mean, talk about incest. It's another case where a young girl with a very extremely sensitive, receptive sensibility fastens on somebody, I suppose, inappropriate in her own family, and there's a strong current between her and her father, which is unsettling and damaging, and feels like might be whatever the problem is. And we're not here. This is not the biographical fallacy, because the problem is in the books. It's written down in the books, and it's sort of like, as with Dorothy, the secret subject of the books in some sense.
And I wonder if it has something to do with her stopping writing, her just coming up against some unstoppable block in the way. She always wanted to take these stories further, and people did so. Please write more. I think it's Clara Batchelor is in the first one. Then she changes her name. I think the whole interplay between what really happened and she was called Irene Botting, actually. That was her original name. And she changed it to Antonia White, which is much better. You can see why. And her father was a classics scholar and obviously very overbearing, and she had this very frail and beautiful mother, and Antonia White was quite puddingy and had her father's sort of big face, and then she had this frail feminine mother who she kind of despised, and all this fascinating stuff goes into this writer. And yet, I suppose, rather like Jean Rhys, she was able to write in this beautiful, pure, clear way. It's no effort to read whatsoever. So
if a writer is writing about a terrible, terrible mess inside them, one requires of them that they somehow see it for what it is, and that it feels like that in that first volume of Frost in May, and it feels like that in Jean Rhys as well. I mean, it's not because she sees, oh, really, there's a lovely sunlit world somewhere where everything's all right, but having a sort of purchase on your own problem. That's an extraordinary thing that writers do, isn't it? Because it doesn't cure you as a human being, but somehow in your writing persona, you actually are on top of. You have a kind of control over the thing that's a mess.
And I liked as well what you said, Suzie, about being frightened to go back to her. And I think that reading should be frightening. And if you're not frightened by what you're reading, then possibly you're not reading right. You know, it should be this, opening a book, beginning a book, should be as terrifying as beginning any kind of new relationship. I mean, you're going into a room with no floor. And if the book works, you'll never stop falling. And I think that also if you're properly frightened by a reading experience, you're picking up on the risk the writer took to produce that kind of work. And when you said she stopped writing, you can see that she was battling with tremendous risk, with a real kind of, with an interiority that was truly vertiginous.
That's why she's my heroine, because she does give a sense of battling against her demons. And she said something tremendously moving, which later in her life, she had failed relationships with charismatic men. Things didn't really work out for her, but she said an extraordinary thing. And she didn't live very long. She lived till 1980, but I suppose she would have been in her 40s. And she said, I suppose I have to accept that I am a monster. I have to live with that. And then she said, not all writers are monsters, but my kind is. Yeah. And I find that so extraordinarily touching. And she battled through that for such a long time. Gosh, we've gone through so quickly. We're going to very, very quickly say who our second choices are, and they're just equally worth talking about at length. And then we'll ask questions. Yes.
Suzie, Deborah should
You've
read
done
something.
your two because Marguerite Duras is...
But she should read something.
Yes, you should read something, actually. Do you want to do a...
Okay, so I'll just read a page and a half. And this is from an essay stroke memoir, stroke travel writing. This is why I chose the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, because this is called Things I Don't Want to Know. The things I don't want to know are the things I usually end up writing about. And what I mean by that are not the things that we don't need to know, like rubber bands last longer if we put them in the refrigerator. But the things we know but don't want to know we know.
Well, that's unforgettable. I shall take that away with me.
Yeah, or that Mickey Mouse, no, Donald Duck was banned in Finland because he didn't wear pants. We're not there. These are the things we repress, like the Finns repress Donald Duck. Anyway, look, this is called Political Purpose, and the reason that I'm reading it, there are 4 headings, and it's a response to Orwell's 1946 essay, Why I Write. And I thought that I would steal his 4 headings and give them a spin from a female writer's point of view. And his headings are political purpose, historical impulse, sheer egoism, and aesthetic pleasure. Now, I can't really, it's so impossible to extract from this, so you're just going to have to bear with me a bit, because we're not going to really get on to political purpose, where I give contemporary feminism, the rituals of motherhood and marriage, a bit of an airing. But why I'm reading this is because I wanted to subvert that thing that happens, you know, when Camus writes about male characters who have existential crises, they sort of noble. Or when Hamlet stares at a skull and says, to be or not to be. This is deep and dark and profound. And yet when women sort of go there, they're kind of hysterical or neurotic or mad. So anyway, this is political purpose. You are your life and nothing else. That's a quote from Jean-Paul Sartre. That spring, when life was very hard and I was at war with my lot and simply couldn't see where there was to get to, I seemed to cry most on escalators at train stations. Going down them was fine, but there was something about standing still and being carried upwards that did it. From apparently nowhere, tears poured out of me, and by the time I got to the top and felt the wind rushing in, it took all my effort to stop myself from sobbing. It was as if the momentum of the escalator, carrying me forwards and upwards, was a physical expression of a conversation I was having with myself. Hello. Escalators, which in the early days of their invention were known as travelling staircases.
Is it us?
Shouldn't bring your mobile. Escalators, which in the early day of their invention were known as travelling staircases or magic stairways, had mysteriously become danger zones. I knew things had to change when one week I found myself staring intently at a poster in my bathroom titled The Skeletal System. This featured a human skeleton with its inner organs and bones labelled in Latin, and which I constantly misread as the societal system. I made a decision. If escalators had become machines with torrid emotionality, a system that transported me to places I did not want to go, why not book a flight to somewhere I actually did want to go? 3 days later, I zipped up my brand new laptop and found myself sitting in the aisle seat 22C heading for Palma, Mallorca. As the plane took off, I realized that being stranded between the earth and the sky was a bit like being on an escalator. The man unlucky enough to be sitting next to a weeping woman looked like he'd once been in the army and now spent his life lying on a beach. I was pleased my cheap airline buddy was a tough guy with hard square shoulders and jagged welts of sunburn striping his thick neck, because I did not want anyone to attempt to comfort me. If anything, my tears seemed to send him into a tantric shopping coma. He called for the air hostess and ordered 2 cans of beer, a vodka and Coke, an extra Coke, a tube of Pringles, a scratch card, a teddy bear stuffed with mini chocolate bars, a Swiss watch on special offer, and asked the crew if the airline had one of those questionnaires to fill in where you get a free holiday if it's drawn out of the hat. The tanned military man pushed the teddy bear into my face and said, "That'll cheer you up, if nothing will," as if the bear was a handkerchief with glass eyes sewn on it.
I'm going to ask everybody to have one sentence on their second choice, which is very hard, but Tessa, go
It was
for
very hard, but I've chosen a rather obvious one, wonderful Canadian short story writer Alice Munro.
Why is she your heroine?
Because she just takes the ordinary stuff and transforms it into something astonishing and incomprehensible.
Frances?
Virginia Woolf's essays about writers. Sometimes they were just essays written for the TLS. Occasionally they were written for women's magazines, but they're just pen and ink sketches, 3 pages long. They make you wonder why any biography needs to be longer than 3 pages.
Perfect.
Margaret. And it would be her novel, The Lover, because of the way it pulls time through that novel. It starts with her old, it then goes to her childhood, 15, she's 15, so her teenagehood, 15 in Saigon, and a kind of affair she has with an older Chinese man. So she looks at colonialism and how it messes everybody up, and she looks at desire and how hard it is to claim it.
And I'm going to get the baggiest writer imaginable, dear Iris Murdoch, and her huge unedited novels, because she's so damn readable, and possibly nobody quite got the novel of ideas as brilliantly as Iris Murdoch. So, and I'd say The Sea, yes. Wonderful, wonderful novel. Right, we've got some time for some questions and roving mics. Has anybody got any questions or observations or any writers that they would like to recommend, or heroines? Right here, mic on its way.
I would just love to hear some recommendations of female writers who are writing now that you would recommend to us to read.
Alice Munro is still alive.
She is. Lovely Irish novelist Deirdre Madden is one of my recent finds. She's marvellous.
For me, the most consistently interesting and innovative writers are Jeanette Winterson and Ali Smith.
Yeah.
Ali Smith, yeah.
Yeah, Ali Smith. Again, she's always completely wonderful.
I like Sarah Waters is wonderful, yeah. And also Scarlett Thomas, because her heroines are nerdy, maths obsessed, quite cool people, and I'm not like that at all, and I love reading about them.
I think Rachel Cusk as well is she's very edgy and always gets people's backs up, which is a good thing.
Oh, and I tell you, a really exciting new writer is Joanna Welsh. She's just published a collection of short stories called Fractals, and it's published by Beggar Press, and I highly recommend those. I think they're incredible.
Anybody else? Right, here's a yes, just there.
As you mentioned a French writer already, what do you think of Simone de Beauvoir as a writer?
Yes, well, her novels. I've got all her novels, and they are quite dull.
And then?
And I have all her theory, which is mind-blowing. So I just, for me, she was one of those writers who sort of explored her theory in her novels less successfully than
Iris Murdoch.
Yes,
Yeah.
because Iris Murdoch is sort of dramatised philosophy, didn't she?
Yes, and Simone de Beauvoir simply couldn't do that. It shows how brilliant Murdoch was, that that her novels managed to carry the weight of those ideas.
And I think it's because of the characters.
Yeah.
I think instead of going, here are the ideas, she really was character driven. So actually, the first 5 pages of an Iris Murdoch novel, you just think, I can't really get, they're called Quentin and Horatia, and they live in Hampstead, it's all ridiculous. And then page 6, you were like, oh my God, how are they ever going to, it's just incredible.
There's a lot of
what she
incest
does.
in Iris Murdoch as well.
Yeah, there is, isn't there? Yes.
Seems to be.
I don't want that to be the theme of Don't take that away with you. Were you going to add something?
No. I'm afraid I haven't read Simone de Beauvoir's novels. I think they've sat on my shelf in the way that Gertrude Stein sat on Deborah's, and I was hoping that by osmosis I would eventually have read them, but it hasn't happened.
Wouldn't that be great? You almost feel as if you do get certain books by. I mean, 50 Shades of Grey. I've never read, but I feel like I have.
I really think you
by
probably
osmosis.
have read it to all intents and purposes.
One quick question. Let's have that one there, and then we're out of time, I'm afraid.
A female writing friend and I recently realised that although we knew quite a lot about friendships between male writers and friendships between male and female writers, the friendships between our female literary heroines didn't trip off the tongue so easily. And I just wondered why you thought that might be.
Oh my gosh, what
Yeah,
an interesting...
there was among those modernists, actually, that sort of Bloomsbury set, that Bowen wasn't in that set. She knew Virginia Woolf quite well. She wrote rather beautifully about her when she died, actually. And Catherine Mansfield, Virginia Woolf says some cruel things about Mansfield in her diary, but that's what friends do, I think.
Yes.
And Catherine Mansfield hugely loved Woolf and cared what she thought. That was a real friendship, actually. I think it was, despite the things in the diary.
There was a very warm friendship between Elizabeth Gaskell and Charlotte Bronte, which is striking for its rareness. And I think that's such an interesting point. I feel slightly floored by it, actually. It's so true.
And I think Antonia White just felt very rivalrous.
Yes.
Sylvia Plath, as we know, I mean, she wrote about Adrienne Rich and,
Yes.
But we mustn't.
Curious.
We mustn't give away. It isn't because women writers can't be friends with other women writers, is it? No more than men. The rivalrousness is there among male writers just to the same degree. I wonder if in the 19th century it's actually sort of physical that male writers moved to London or followed their careers, whereas often the women writers were more scattered and they were doing it, as it were, more with their left hand or more privately, and not thinking, well, obviously this will take me to where the literary thing is happening and where the publishers are.
It's an excellent question.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Jack Kerouac and Burroughs and Ginsberg and all of that. And I mean, let's be honest, Virginia Woolf did say that Catherine Mansfield stunk like a polecat. And published it.
She said there could be a little book of all the nasty things Virginia Woolf said about other women writers. I remember her saying about...
Or about everybody. I mean, she did...
She was a sister, Virginia Woolf. I won't hear a word
Well,
of it.
she's one of my heroines, but she did make brilliantly withering comments about most of her contemporary women
I don't
writers.
think William Burroughs was that nice about Jack Kerouac, on his off moments. You can be a friend and still be being biting and...
And it's less about friendship than support, I think, whether these women were standing next to each other in the same way that Byron would support Shelley and Coleridge would support Wordsworth.
I'm really going to think about that. I think it's great. Maybe women don't make each other legends in the way that male writers do when they write about sort of male friendship. And maybe we should get on with it.
Well, we've got 3 legends here. Oh, 3 wonderful writers. Please read their books as well. Thank you very much for coming along. I hope you found that interesting and stimulating. Thank you, Tessa, Frances Wilson, Deborah Levy.
Thank you.
Do read their books. Thanks very much for coming.